Okay, I think we'll make a start now. Hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar on charting the course for the next decade of sustainability research and innovation, which follows on from a special collection organized by Future Earth, published in Global Sustainability. In a moment, I'll hand over to Judith Ungvari, who will introduce the speakers, and then Gilles Schwinn, who will introduce the collection. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have all joined in listen-only mode. This means you'll be able to hear us, but not able to speak to us. However, you will have the opportunity to submit chat questions by typing your questions into the Q&A of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the webinar. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. If we're unable to get through all of the questions during the session, they will be included in the follow-up email that we will send after the webinar. Should you experience any technical difficulties, please add these to the questions box, and a member of the organizing team will endeavor to help you. In the unlikely event that we do experience any issues, we will message the audience and restart the webinar. To summarize, you can submit your questions at any time, and you'll also receive a follow-up email at the end to know how useful you found it and another opportunity to ask any questions that you have. Now I'll hand over to Judith.
Thank you, Natalie. Welcome, everyone. It is great to see so many familiar names, and it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, starting off with our moderator team. My colleague, Gilles Schwinn, is joining from the Future Earth Global Secretariat, and he's also affiliated with the University of Tokyo, Japan. Gilles' activities transcend traditional scientific boundaries. He's a boundary spanner, indeed, employing transdisciplinary system science approach that centers on urban planning and public health scenarios. Gilles, together with me, coordinates Future Earth's global research networks, spearheading the development of processes that foster collaboration across diverse disciplines, and actively contributes to the efforts to increase the relevance of science for transformations. And I myself, as second moderator, am Judith Ungvari. I'm also from Future Earth Global Secretariat Hub. I'm affiliated with George Mason University in the United States. I'm an ecologist by training with expertise in tropical avian biology, but I have been working on the interface of science and policy for 6 years now in support of transdisciplinary global change research. As a co-lead research innovation at Future Earth, I work primarily supporting the global research networks, just like Gilles, and also other research initiatives and funding opportunities. Now I would like to introduce our speakers as well. Next slide, please. Our speakers today are authors of research papers in the special collection. With us, we are going to have Paul Srivastava, who is a professor of management and organizations at Pennsylvania State University and has served for 5 years as the university's chief sustainability officer and director of the Sustainability Institute. Since December 2023, he was elected as co-president of the Club of Rome, and previously he served as the founding executive director of Future Earth. We also have Frances Harris, who is a reader in education and the environment at the University of Hertfordshire. Frances has been involved in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research concerning food production, natural resource management, rural livelihoods, and environmental education in the UK, Africa, and Asia. We also have Thomas Hickman, associate professor at the Department of Political Science at Lund University in Sweden. Thomas is concerned with the study of political responses to global environmental changes and related transboundary sustainability challenges. He is especially intrigued by the questions of how societies can adequately deal with global common goods and which institutions need to be in place to overcome collective action problems. With these esteemed speakers, I would like to hand it over to my co-moderator, Gilles. Please introduce the special collection.
Thank you so much. So we're really honored that you're all joining us today. This was not a usual special collection. We are really gathering insights from across the Future community and way beyond that. So Future Earth is really a global organization. It's probably one of the few organizations that can represent such a diverse voice from science, both in terms of geographical diversity, but also in terms of actual disciplinary diversity and sector representation. We have 9 global secretariat hubs, 16 national and local networks in various parts of the world, and various partners in other parts of the world. We have 27 global research networks. Each of these have several hundreds, in some cases, several thousands of members that are backing the scientific work that they are doing. All in all, this comes to a rough estimate of 30,000 experts from various parts of the world that are coming together to work on a common mission and vision to provide the science for various initiatives, science policy, or engagement for informing decision makers and various other processes. The special collection was developed with that community, means that this was not a top-down decision of we're going to work on these topics. We had an open call inviting ideas for special issues. We had 7 different proposals that were being developed. We ended up with one that has most aligned with the mission and vision and could span the diversity that we are hoping to represent with the organization. So charting the course for the next decade for sustainability research and innovation already says a lot. It's bringing forward the state of the art and diverse sustainability related fields, but it's also opening up questions related to transdisciplinary science, how to engage a number of different stakeholders for making the science policy interface more robust, investigating cultural, historical, and developmental tensions, particularly in terms of long-term sustainability and, of course, reducing inequalities and ensuring justice. Providing important insights into how and why multi-actor processes fail or succeed. So there's so much work being done on transdisciplinary science, but some of them are not always working as we are hoping that they would. This is still very much a process that is under development. So we really wanted to provide a space where people could share successes or failures of those initiatives. And then, of course, generating integrated knowledge for successful transformations towards good and fair societies. We're doing that not just by looking at the literature that's already been there and synthesizing that, but also providing some insights on how that would look like in the future. So spanning for the next decade or so on what the critical research questions are going forward. So we mentioned briefly earlier the 27 global research networks. We've categorized them here in a couple of teams because there's too many to go into detail. So we are working on water, oceans, climate, health, governance, society, land, biodiversity, and really everything in between that and beyond. There's also various initiatives that are project-based that are tackling a number of other topics. In the special collection, we have representation of the following networks. The ones in red are representation in the guest editorial team. The ones that are full blue circles are really dedicated papers. And then the ones that are half circles are from cross-cutting initiatives that are represented in the special issue as well. We're giving you a kind of broad overview in this introduction. So we could observe a number of emerging themes and their emphasis on the central themes that I just introduced in the previous slide. So some of the emerging themes are evolutionary and ecological processes. We'll hear some of the work from, for example, Paul Srivastava in a minute. Topics related to governance and policy. What does the science say about how far we are at with tackling the SDGs and so forth? Land use and climate change, of course, massive topic, is able to incorporate a number of different disciplinary fields with a focus on geography, urban planning, and so forth. And then the very well represented emerging theme of inter and transdisciplinary research, where interdisciplinary is really focusing on working across the disciplines, and transdisciplinary is really how the research community, but also other communities, are coming together to work on tackling common issues with aligning their priorities, their resources, and so forth. So without further ado, I would like to call in the first speaker, and I'm just quickly checking in my attendance sheet here. And we're gonna go straight to Francis. Francis, the floor is yours.
Hello, and thank you. It's a pleasure to be able to speak at this and talk about the paper that I co-authored with 3 others, including Gilles, who was just speaking, on working with the tensions of transdisciplinary research, a review agenda for the future of knowledge co-production in the Anthropocene. Our paper recognizes the growing importance of transdisciplinary research, which is required to address the more complex, what are sometimes called wicked problems of the Anthropocene. And in our paper, we define transdisciplinarity as research which is both interdisciplinary and involves working with partners from beyond academia. And the paper itself focuses on the processes of transdisciplinary research. And we review papers which reflect on and evaluate the strengths and challenges of this approach. And in this diagram, what you can see is the mix of sort of academic space and different disciplines coming in, as well as the range of different people from what we've called the practice space who come together. And as a group at the center are the transdisciplinary space. That's what we've been investigating. And we conclude with some comments on what makes a good transdisciplinarian as well. We used a typical project framework of problem identification and framing, building teams, agreeing methods, analyzing and publication and dissemination, and subsequent evaluation as the sort of stages through which we looked at the literature and sorted our information. And we used the lens of institutional logics to frame our analysis. And institutional logics, very simply, is defined as the norms, cultures, and values of an organization or of a sector. So, for example, academia has very different norms, cultures, and values than perhaps government and policymakers or environmental conservation groups and charities. Next slide, please. Can we go down a slide, please?
Seems to take a little while.
Okay. Right. So following our review of 221 papers, we identified key strategies for supporting transdisciplinary research processes. Firstly, acknowledging, accepting, and living with the inherent tensions which arise from managing diversity, from the tangled agendas that come together in a transdisciplinary project, from working with diverse cultures, values, methods, and reward systems amongst the research team. So there are those tensions and we need to live with them. The importance of bringing together and building strong collaborative relationships among the team, balancing diversity and wider skills and knowledge with the need to bridge that cognitive distance between different people. Relationships and trust among the research team members are crucial. Bringing diverse participants together and their perspectives to align towards common research goals and outcomes can be a challenge as well. People come to these projects each with their own views. We've got to get them all working towards the same common outcome. Acknowledging and managing power. Power is an issue that was sort of referred to sometimes tangentially, but how is power exerted? How do we manage it? It was recognized that facilitators and stakeholder workshops were incredibly important in supporting that, as well as managing expectations. And finally, allowing time for co-reflection and learning within the project, recognizing that it is an added level of complexity to be working in a transdisciplinary way. So allowing time for that reflection, even for room to fail, as some projects refer to it, within the project timeframe, as knowledge creation may not be a straightforward process. We also recognize that it's really important to discuss with all team members, as well as the funders, what the outputs will be. to ensure that they satisfy the different needs of all the different groups that are coming together. Defining success is contingent on values, expectations, culture, language, and reward structures, and those may differ amongst all the participants, as well as what the funders want or what the end users want. And finally, we concluded that transdisciplinary research is often seen as challenging, as an individual's theoretical framing of problems and methodological approaches are often confronted with other people's views within the team. Some people love this, and they love the engagement and the debate and the excitement. There are others who might say that they don't like it and would prefer to retreat to the relative safety of their disciplinary silos. The literature did raise two questions. Firstly, what makes a good transdisciplinary researcher? And secondly, how can transdisciplinary researchers be supported when academia is generally structured around disciplinary themes? Fundamentally, the question is, what does academia need to do to facilitate engagement in transdisciplinary research? I'll leave it there with those questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Frances, and then we'll go straight to Thomas.
Yeah, thanks very much for the kind introduction and also the invitation to this webinar. And it's really a pleasure to be here, also to be part of this collection of interesting articles. And the paper I present here is a collaboration of 33 authors, so quite a big team. And at least two of these authors are also here in the room. So I'm happy to be joined by them. And you're most welcome also to join the discussion afterwards. So it's a joint product of the SDG task force, which is part of the Earth System Governance Project, which is also part of Future Earth. So I'm happy to be here and present this. And in this paper, we assess very much the impact of the Sustainable Development Goals that are part of the 2030 Agenda, adopted in 2015, as you all know. And we assess the impact on key governance areas. So the SDG impact assessment that was published in 2022 by Cambridge University Press with a condensed version also in Nature Sustainability highlighted that the overall impact of the SDG is rather limited, with much variation across sectors, countries, and governance areas. But then we decided to go one step ahead and delve deeper to conduct a more fine-grained analysis to explore how incremental changes are taking place because of the Sustainable Development Goals. And by this means, with this clear objective, we aim to highlight under what conditions small success stories, so far we only have smaller success stories of the SDGs, can in the end bolster, provide and offer a larger transformation towards sustainable development up to 2030, but perhaps even beyond. So what are the building blocks we can perhaps upscale towards a larger transformation? And in particular, we looked at five governance areas. We looked first of all at global governance, looking at some international organizations, United Nations organizations that use the SDGs in their spectrum of activities. Secondly, we looked at national policy integration. We identified some countries that are more progressive and implement the SDGs, use them in their national plans and strategies. Thirdly, we looked at cities and regional governments, subnational entities we called, and we found out that also here we have some more progressive players on the ground, so to say. Fourthly, we looked at private governance, to what extent businesses and their associations use the SDGs. And finally, fifthly, we also looked at education and learning as a very important governance area for sustainable development. Please go to the next slide, in which I will try to then jump to the findings of our article. So in a nutshell, we observed that there's rather a patchy and often, unfortunately, primarily symbolic uptake of the SDGs. On the one hand, we identified indeed some pioneering initiatives by different actors. I named them in my earlier slide, from the global north and the global south. So progressive governments, but also some businesses, and there are nevertheless, unfortunately, no clear pathways towards sustainable development. So the individual success stories that we identified are quite inspiring, and we highlight them in our article. But our conclusion is that it remains unclear how these smaller scale success stories can be upscaled. And the majority of actors and institutions continue rather business as usual, despite the SDGs, sometimes even using the SDGs for rainbow or greenwashing activities. So taking stock of governance by goal setting, the idea of setting voluntary goals at the global level and then foster political changes at national and also local level, the question arises whether this mode of governance actually is effective at all. Or to put it bluntly, we ask whether it's worthwhile that the United Nations and many other actors put so much effort and resources in spreading the SDGs. But we can also, of course, try to formulate it more positively and argue we have to find out how this kind of governance of goal setting can be made more effective for the future to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs based on voluntary global policy goals. So this is, in our view, an ambitious and challenging research agenda we are still pursuing, and it requires, of course, contributions from many different research directions. So therefore, we would like to invite all researchers here also to join our SDG task force of the Earth System Governance Projects. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Thomas. And before we go to the next speaker soon, I just have a really burning question, and I think this is a burning question that many people are increasingly sort of frustrated about. What did you find are sort of like the major barriers to like really having the implementation, really having realization of the 2030 agenda and the SDGs?
Yeah, good point. So first of all, I mentioned briefly the voluntary nature of the SDGs, so which allows all countries to actually use the SDGs for their own benefits, to increase their own self-interest. And this is related to also an increasing gap between what governments and other actors promise to do and what they actually also do on the ground. And then related to that, I would say that political will, the lack of political will, is one of the major obstacles for the SDGs to be implemented. We had the Summit of the Future just last week. That was a bit, again, perhaps some positive milestone, but we don't know how the summit and the Pact of the Future will then be translated into politics on the ground. But at least, I can say that voluntary nature, the growing gap of promises and action, and lastly, the lack of political will are major obstacles for the SDGs to gain traction.
And does the work that Francis conducted, does that give any insights potentially in how some of these challenges can be overcome kind of through the transdisciplinary approach?
Certainly, I loved her paper and the presentation just now, giving a nice idea. I think this is one way to go. I think transdisciplinary approaches will help to overcome these obstacles to some extent. So we as researchers, I think, are also required to leave our comfort zones and work directly together with civil society and also policymakers, stakeholders. Although perhaps, including me, we feel sometimes a bit uncomfortable to do that. Normally, we are used to sit in our offices and write our papers. But I think it's really important to step out of our roads and become active in this important and critical time.
So I think maybe I can jump in with a follow-up question to Francis as well, considering her paper. And I would love to know what makes a good transdisciplinarian. We heard Thomas's perspective, but Francis, would you like to add something? Please unmute.
Sorry, that is a really interesting question. in looking at how people reflected on the transdisciplinary process and the range of different perspectives that the papers took, fundamentally, I think it's about humility and the ability to communicate well what you do in a way that's accessible to other people, because you can't have collaboration either across disciplines or between academia and outside of academia if people can't understand each other. And so there's quite a few publications about the choice of language used, not using jargon, but also so part of it is about being willing to explain yourself well, but also about being willing to listen to other people's perspectives and points of view and to identify the common ground. Now, that's not to say that transdisciplinarians don't believe fundamentally in the rigors of their discipline and what they know, but that ability to not just say my way is the best way, but to actually be able to say, yes, there are different things we can do here. There are different ways we can approach things. That's an interesting perspective. How can we make these work together? And fundamentally, there was often a lot of compromise over what made a suitable method to collect data that was going to be considered valid and reliable, and for academics, publishable. But for non-academics, of course, the sort of, as Thomas alluded to, what we academics want to do isn't what they want to do. So that's another element of it as well.
And Frances, you talk about it, especially, of course, being in an academic context, but what is sort of for you, or from the work that you did, what is sort of the ideal transdisciplinarian? Like, in which space does this person belong? Is it like an academic? Is it somebody from the private sector? Does it need to be a government, or is this something that needs to be driven by another sector, or how do you see this happening in reality?
Interestingly, what some of the work has identified is what's called boundary spanners, people who span two different areas. So a lot of my earlier work was done in and around this sort of agri-environmental sector, and you might have people who are from a farming background but have gone into academic research, but they know how to talk to farmers about farming as well as then turn around and talk to the researchers in the patter and the phraseology that they want. And you can have boundary spanners across any boundary, but often it is about people who have worked in one sector and then moved across to another, or grown up in one sector if they're farmers. And so that becomes the important way to facilitate that collaboration. People who feel in their comfort zone in different spaces. Thomas alluded to, getting out of your comfort zone. Well, I think a good transdisciplinarian is someone who can not feel too uncomfortable and can communicate across those divides.
Right. And so back to Thomas, in that context, especially if we're, utilizing those opportunities as good boundary spanners as we are, what is the chance of that successfully implementing the SDGs? Especially, and I'm referring to the question that's in the Q&A box where I invite everybody to contribute to, by the way, especially in the context of the most vulnerable with least basic resources available, sometimes in a context of conflict or climate-related disasters, or what are you seeing as the opportunities there?
You mean the abilities for accelerating implementation of the SDGs, right? And well, the SDGs are really high and unprecedented vision that has been adopted, what is it now, 9 years ago. But the question is how they trickle down to the ground. And we see them sometimes on posters in schools, maybe also in universities. But what is lacking, I think, is that they are really integrated into our political systems. And I think we would, in political science at least, we would call it accountability mechanisms, accountability ecosystems that need to emerge in order to make these SDGs then also an integral element of national public administrative systems. And I think this is perhaps now the important step to realize. So after we have raised awareness about the SDGs. We have perhaps also seen and witnessed that the SDGs have changed our discourses, our debate, have popularized the debate about sustainable development. Now it's time to go one step ahead and integrate these SDGs into national policy making processes. Because I think without these accountability mechanisms and clear functions, how to hold those responsible and power to account for what they have signed actually 9 years ago, the idea of the SDGs will rather be forgotten in a couple of years from now. So we need stronger oversight by parliaments. We need also national auditing institutions and also national human rights institutions that are taking care of the SDGs. And they can be seen as cornerstones, I think, for holding governments at all levels accountable. I think this is also how we can see the 2030 agenda and the SDGs as a global vision, but it needs to be taken care of. And it needs to take root also through the integration of the 17 SDGs into political systems in domestic levels.
Thanks for that reflection. And I really appreciate that we can hear from both of you directly on that. And I hope in a minute or so we're going to have Paul that's going to come in, that's going to talk about the kind of transdisciplinary approaches that he's been doing in his work, especially working very intensely with the business sector and the finance sector. But before we do, there are a number of papers in the special collection that my colleague Judith has kindly shared in the chat that are tackling a number of related issues, including there's a paper focusing there on pathways for sustainability. So there are various aspects, various learnings already collected in various of the manuscripts that we've managed to collect in the special collection. Another question, and I'll pass on to Judith in a bit for that as well. But what do you feel what is the kind of the role, especially if you're working across different sectors, across different teams, Francis, when it comes to building trust? Like, how do you do that? And how do you get to a level of trust where people are working in such different environments?
Thank you. Yes, it's a challenge. Quite often with transdisciplinary projects, there's a call put out and they want a transdisciplinary team. And therefore people are pulling together a team and embarking on a bid, probably for lots of money over quite a few years. And obviously that's a big undertaking. And if you're just pulling people together who you don't really know, it can feel like quite a risk as well, particularly when they are people who aren't from your disciplines, you didn't know them before, you don't really understand how good their reputation is. So what we found was that actually quite a lot of projects start because there is already the relationship and the informal chat about what do you do, what do I do? Oh, that's kind of interesting. Would it do this? How would it help with my problem? And that those relationships are then the basis of forming teams. And that means that people already know each other, already have a sense of who they're going to be working with. Now, of course, any bid is developed to respond to a call, and you often need more people. So trust is actually quite important because someone will say, I know somebody who I could bring into the team, and they are vouching for another academic and bringing them in. And that's an important part of how those teams have formed. But of course, the other element of trust is that within a diverse project with a lot of different themes and a lot of different disciplines involved, no individual can be expert in everything. So you do just have to trust the other people on the team that they really understand that bit. They've got that section of the project sorted. And that can feel a little risky if you like to be fully in control. But it's again, it's an element of where trust comes in. And we did write a separate paper all about trust in relationships, and it's referenced in this paper, looking in detail at 10 case studies of interdisciplinary projects and how that worked. But I think the final element of trust, and it does relate to the tensions as well, is that it's about trust to finish off the project completely. So one of the tensions that arises in projects is that, and this relates to the institutional logics, for an academic, it's perhaps about setting the research question, getting the data, and then writing the paper, because in academia, that's kind of what we're meant to do, isn't it? But for other project partners, that's not the end of the project. It's implementing those results, testing them out, revising and tweaking things if they don't work. And for others, it's about evidencing an impact on the ground of whatever the project was about. And so trust is also about trusting people to stick with it right till the end and not to sort of drop off once they've got what they want out of a project, and leaving other people, in a sense, high and dry, or feeling that they've been sort of partners on the way, but then abandoned. So trust comes into things in lots of different ways.
Thank you so much for those answers to these questions about transdisciplinarity at large and SDGs. I would like to jump into the Q&A where we have some really specific questions now coming up. The first one is perhaps for you, Frances. How can agricultural and biosystems engineers develop sustainable food production systems that address food security challenges while minimizing land use, water consumption, and greenhouse gas emissions? I guess this is an SDG-related question as well, but the food element perhaps is really specific.
I think if I had a short answer to that, we'd all be able to go home, wouldn't we? How can we do it? Well, it is a balancing act, isn't it? And I know that in Britain, they're spending a lot of effort looking at that balance between using land for renewables, using land for carbon sequestration, and using land for food production. And there will be some interesting emerging tensions out of this, because we have a lot of change in policy at the moment in the UK. And more globally, I think those tensions will appear as well. I don't think I have a short answer to how that works, but I think it is about trade-offs and benefit stacking. So you're trying to get multiple benefits out of one piece of land. And it is going to involve a lot of people working together and recognizing that maybe it's not optimizing everything, but having a consensus around getting slightly lower returns on all those different goals, but overall getting more goals out of one area of land.
I really appreciate your attempt to answer that. And indeed, that's a wicked problem, and there's no way to answer it very quickly. And indeed, if we could go home and have it all solved. Well, we now have our panelist, Dr. Paul Srivastava, joining. So I think we are going to get to the presentation of his paper shortly. The floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Oh, I am so thoroughly rattled by this time. I spend 40 hours a week on Zoom, and it has taken me the last hour to try to get in. So I'm very sorry for being late. I want to begin by thanking Giles and Judith and all of you for this opportunity to share some thoughts on not just the paper, because the paper is already there. You all have probably read at least a social media summary, if not the whole paper, but just talk about this issue of transdisciplinarity and science and where we are headed in the coming decade of sustainability research and innovation. So it's amazing to see so much interest in transdisciplinarity and in SR&I. It's a very vital task for science. My main message for this discussion is that science has already provided excellent answers to the key challenges of the Anthropocene, including climate change. And now it is time to act. In coalition with stakeholders, to make systemic changes in all our economic processes and systems of sustainable development. Towards this end, towards this goal, the Club of Rome that I'm now co-directing and presiding over is assisting to implement the United Nations General Assembly resolution of last year to establish the International Decade of Science for Sustainable Development. We are collaborating with UNESCO, with Future Earth, with many other organizations to help build this Earth Humanity Coalition, which is earth-humanity.org for those of you who want to look it up. It's an effort that seeks to address these problems of the Anthropocene through transformative and co-designed collaboration with scientists, artists, policymakers, and citizens. It seeks to push science towards not just the policy interface, but the impact interface, the action, the people interface, which is also in some ways the topic of the paper that we had in this special issue of Global Sustainability. So let me say a few words about the paper. The special issue overall is amazing. It covers such a wide variety of topics, from large-scale computational models to governance of sustainable development and evolution of the sciences, sustainability sciences, the role of transdisciplinarity in that, and the tensions of doing transdisciplinary work. So it's a really rich compilation that I urge all of our viewers today to at least glance through. The paper that we did was titled From Climate Science to Climate Action. It is co-authored with Dr. Fumiko Kasuga of Future Earth Japan and Dr. John Grant, an independent consultant on climate in Colorado. Our intention was to try to not just provide some suggestions for action, but also to try to tell scientists that we have a different and a new role to play. Of course, moving towards action largely is a thing that governments and corporations and many other actors in society have to take part in. But I think scientists have a particular role to play and a particular responsibility that maybe I'll come to in a few minutes or during the discussion. And I'm emphasizing this need for action because doing research is not enough. Doing science is not enough. We've been doing this science for climate science, at least for 100 years, maybe longer. And the longer we wait, the worse the real world situation gets. From the time the call for papers for this special issue was announced in 2021, the carbon in Earth's atmosphere was 413 parts per million. Today, as we're having this discussion to just get going with the papers and the research, the carbon is already at 422 parts per million and growing, and it represents about a 0.5% rise each year. So there is perfectly good climate science out there that has provided very good solutions that we should be implementing. And our focus is on pushing a few levers of change. And I will just mention 3 to get the discussion rolling, but there are many, many, many things that need to be done. So the 3 that we highlight are imposing an improved taxation regime worldwide, recognizing that we cannot continue to go down the fossil fuel development lane, imposing taxes in a way that at least the windfall profits that oil companies and fossil fuel companies are making, and also the luxury consumption that is happening of natural resources, those things should be definitely covered, but the tax regime should be uniform across the world so that companies can't escape reducing carbon production and consumption by moving themselves around or going into tax havens. Secondly, we think there are unnecessary and actually vicious subsidies to fossil fuel firms that need to be reduced or eliminated. And instead, we need to revitalize and make more competitive the renewable energy sector so that we have sufficient energy. And By sufficient energy, I don't mean any amount of energy that each country embarks on, but some kind of a meaningful energy consumption that allows development in different parts of the world to occur at a reasonable rate. And then the third big lever that we see is recognizing that excess deaths caused by carbon pollution is a form of homicide. 5 million people are getting killed each year because of carbon pollution and other forms of pollution. And unless we say this is not acceptable as a society, we're not going to stop it. We have been successful in attributing harm caused by different types of pollution, example with asbestos and with tobacco, and holding responsible those companies that are putting this pollution out. So those are some of the initial ideas. Of course, this is not a complete list, but I thought I'll just stop over here and open up the conversation so that we can have some further discussion on the points that are made by all the papers. Thank you so much for your patience.
Really appreciate you being here and sharing your thoughts and the details of your paper as well. We are receiving several questions now in the Q&A, and also it would be maybe perhaps good to go back and talk a little bit more about the challenges of transdisciplinarity and addressing the Sustainable Development Goals as we are speeding towards 2030. That's a theme that is relevant among all three of our speakers and also among some of the Q&A. So right now, while I ask the question, I would like to request that our panelists perhaps can answer some of the questions with typing in, because we don't have a lot of time, while we also have a discussion in the remaining time about transdisciplinarity and sustainability. So maybe we can go to a question and think about maybe transdisciplinarity means different things to different people. And we heard some of the elements that are relevant in transdisciplinarity from Francis and Thomas. But maybe, Paul, you can add, how can transdisciplinarity be made more action and impact oriented and maybe step out of the academic ivory tower and really become a solution?
Yeah, I think for me, transdisciplinarity is mostly about action and impact. And I think there are institutional barriers that we need to deal with within at least some universities around the world, which don't prioritize action and impact and are very happy to interpret impact in academic terms, in terms of how many papers got published and how much grants were brought in and how many citations were done, which is fine, but that's not impact on the world. I think we need to recognize that impact on the world means engaging the world, and universities need to provide reward systems that allow faculty members, encourage faculty members to go out. And researchers themselves, I think there is a self-imposed censorship. We think of ourselves as knowledge producers, which is fine. And we've done that for 300 years of science. But the Anthropocene calls science to take a different role in society, and for scientists to develop an identity that they're also citizens, they're also parents, they're also neighbors. They need to engage the world where it is with their expertise, change their own eco-footprint, change the eco-footprint of the institutions. I mean, university, like it is, when I was the chief sustainability officer of Penn State University, I realized $9 billion a year budget is more than the GDP of 40 countries. And here we go and tell all these 40 countries what they should do. Well, what are we doing within Penn State and our 23 campuses and our 100,000 students and our eco-footprint? So I think there's a lot to be done to engage and act, but I think we have self-defined ourselves as knowledge producers more, and perhaps in some ways knowledge distributors in our classrooms and education. But we are not self-defining ourselves as agents for climate action, agents for biodiversity preservation. So some of it is just mental fog that we need to get rid of. And then, of course, institutional barriers like reward systems and recognition and funding and financing, all of those are important. But I'll stop over there because I think on this panel and certainly among the audience, there are many, many views of what transdisciplinarity really means. Thank you.
Thank you. It was great to hear the perspective on transdisciplinarity from all of our speakers. So now I will invite our speakers for final reflections of maybe a 1-minute answer tops on this question. After all of the challenges that we have discussed related to the Sustainable Development Goals and transdisciplinarity in general, what keeps us optimistic for the future? And perhaps looking at the panelists on my screen, first, Francis, since you're unmuted, would you like to answer this question?
Thank you. What keeps me optimistic for the future? I think a feeling that we do have a lot of knowledge. We've got great science. Obviously, there are still more challenges to understanding the environment and the interconnections and things, but we do have a lot of science. And therefore, we have the abilities. It's about the political will and the individual will to make things happen in terms of sustainability. But I do feel that we are much further ahead than we were, say, 30, 40 years ago. And it's a matter of just tipping people over to action. And I think with the growing interest in transdisciplinary approaches and in recognizing that this is one of the ways in which we can get more people communicating and solving things, I'm hopeful that this will result in a better future.
Thank you. Do we have another volunteer? Thomas, please go ahead.
Thanks. Multitasking just answered one question in the Q&A box. But yeah, what makes me optimistic is difficult to say because I have been dealing with the SDGs for a while and we are off track, and we are even more off track than 4 years ago. So the trend is clear, not positive. But nevertheless, I would say that indeed solutions will probably not come from above. So we looked at these small scale solutions in our contribution to the special collection. And also here we saw some pioneering activities on the ground, and we are not seeing a strong upscaling initiative, but at least we have some actors that are going ahead, and that's good to see. And maybe we have to remind us that also these smaller solutions can at least grow in the future. And we had the Summit of the Future a couple of days ago in New York, and we also saw some modest achievements with the Pact of the Future and maybe a bit of a revitalization of the collaboration among countries. So that's also at least some smaller signs for being more hopeful for the next 5 or 6 years under 2030 and beyond.
I can jump in with a view on why I am optimistic. First of all, I think compared to when I started studying sustainability in the 1970s, early 80s, that's a long time ago. The amount of knowledge that has come out in the world, what we know about both the problem, the metricizing the problem, but also about the potential solutions is just breathtaking. So we should be celebrating the realization that something has to be done. So it gives me hope that if we know the solutions, yes, it's true, we are not implementing them at the scale that Thomas suggested in his comments. We are not doing the right things, but at least we know we are not doing the right thing. And we also are actually quite capable of pinpointing where the culprits are, where the leverage points are, and how we can get where we need to get. So that is, to me, very positive. The second thing that gives me hope is when I look at how youth are dealing with their own professional development and careers, and how they are not in the same mindset as my generation people were. They are engaging, they understand the liabilities and the risks that their generations face. I am seeing a huge resurgence, and not just the famous youths that we all hear about at climate conferences, but the masses, my students, my kids, their friends, the public. There is, I think, a groundswell understanding that climate is fundamental, and that the world that we've been living in for the last 50 years is not the normal world. It was a particular blip, and that we need to be rethinking what it means to be humans in a climate-altered world. And I'm having serious conversations with young people who have no knowledge about all this stuff, but they just have a kind of genuine perception that life is changing on Earth, and with 8 billion people going to 10 billion, it's going to be a different world. So I think those are causes for hope and optimism.
Most definitely. Thank you for everybody's thoughts and for everyone's participation in this webinar about the special collection. I'm inviting our colleagues from Cambridge University Press to do a closing right now. Thanks, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Judith. I really hope you've all enjoyed this webinar. I hope it's covered a broad range of questions for you. Any questions remaining that we haven't had time to answer, we will answer in our summary email, including the webinar recording. I'd really like to thank our panelists, Francis, Tom and Paul, for their time today, and to Judith and Gilles for their time and taking part. And thank you very much to everyone who attended. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone. I'm very sorry about the getting in problems, but I'm glad I was able to at least join. Appreciate your help.